All right, so I'll give everyone maybe 60 more seconds to hop in. Oh, thank you, Rebecca. If you have access to the chat, like if you're driving or something, do not attempt this, but I'm just curious what districts you guys are representing. So if you can throw that in, that would be great. It's just for my own, like, I'm just trying to get an idea where everybody is and all that good stuff. All right, Lake Central, three from Lake Central. Oh, wow, okay. So it's great to see everyone from Lake Central. So I'll go ahead. Oh, I got someone else. I'm going to go ahead and get started with this presentation today. So first off, before we even start, I just want to say thank you so much for spending your Friday afternoon with us. You've got a lot of places that you could be on a Friday at 4 o'clock or 3 o'clock, depending on where you are. So I'm thankful that you are here in this training with us today. So my name is Katie Mosley, and I work for the IEP Technical Assistance Center. We're a center with the purpose of just helping teachers, special education administrators to help really increase knowledge, skills, and capacity to increase outcomes for students with disabilities. And so if you are, I know a few of these names I recognize. I have worked with you in the past, so it's great to see you on here again. But if this is your first time joining us, I just want to say thank you so much for being on here with us. So as we move through this training today, I've got a lot of information that I want to share with you. I will be sending out this PowerPoint with your certificates so that you can have access to that. I want you to have access to some of the materials that I'll be sharing with you. So we are going to take a look at indicators 9 and 10. We're going to go through some definitions about those also. And then we're just going to look at analyzing that pre-referral and referral data as we think about disproportionate representation. We're really going to concentrate on some areas of response to instruction and that multi-tiered systems of support so that we can maximize it for all students. As we go through, if you have questions today, please either put them in the chat or you can unmute and ask. It doesn't matter to me if your camera is on or off. I want you to do what is most comfortable for you for sure. And if if you have a question that I am not confident on the answer of, I'm going to be really honest with you and just tell you that I'm not sure of that answer. And I would rather check with someone and get a correct answer for you. I know that the content that we're going to talk about today is harder content. It's not like the it's just not like other stuff. And I want to be sure that as we work through this together, that I'm guiding you and giving you the correct answers and responses to any concerns that you may have. So let's jump in. Let's take a look at indicator 9. So with some of these definitions and these identify pieces, I have pulled this information from our Indiana Department of Education website, and I'm going to give you those websites if you don't know what they are, and I'm going to show you some resource tools that they have set up for districts to use as we look at some of these indicators. So if we just look at the definition, this is the percentage of districts with disproportionate representation of racial ethnic groups due to inappropriate identification. So indicator 9 is looking at dispro from that racial and ethnic group perspective. So when we look at that identify statement, it's identify whether the rate of overall special education identification. So that's the overall rate. That's what we're looking at, of a racial or ethnic group of students compared to all other racial or ethnic groups is disproportionate. So that is really important to keep in mind when we are looking at this indicator. It's the overall rate of special education identification of a racial or ethnic group compared to all other racial or ethnic groups. I just think that's really important to keep that in mind as we go through. So this information is directly from the Department of Education here in Indiana. The DOE does have a root cause analysis tool that you can use if you are found to be out of compliance with indicator 9. So there are links included into the IDEA data center. You can access a success gaps toolkit and a rubric as well. So as we look at what DOE has outlined for us, we want to take several steps. We want to gather data related to current performance to review. So that means we are actively looking at our current referrals, identified areas, and we are always looking at that data so that we know we don't have any surprises later on. And then as we look to find that root cause, if there's an issue, we really want to define the problem. And we're going to talk more about this as we progress through today, but really looking at how to use that, that tool to find where the problem is. So we're looking at that root cause with number 3. So we've got what we think the problem is. Now we're going to identify the root cause. Through that root cause analysis, then we're going to hopefully identify potential solutions. And this is where we're going to create a corrective action plan for the indicator. And then we want to establish a plan for monitoring progress. So looking back at number 1, when I talk about how we want to constantly be gathering that data of referrals and students who are eligible, that's part of that progress monitoring piece. So the more that we are aware of our data on a daily basis, the better we are when it comes to these indicators. All right, so on this slide, there are 2 really great tools for you to use. There is a calculator tool on DOE's website related to indicator 9. So the website, you can see it. If I were talented enough, I would throw that in the chat. I might be able to do that here in a little bit. So if you just want to copy and paste it, that would be appropriate. But even better than just giving you the tool and figuring out how to use it on your own, there is a walkthrough for it. And I highly recommend that you watch the walkthrough video, because when you open the file, you start to look at it, it can look pretty overwhelming if you've never looked at it before. But by watching that walkthrough, you're going to have a much better understanding of what the tool does for you, how to use it, and how to make the most of the information that the tool is giving you. So I recommend, again, that you would watch the walkthrough, maybe even before you open the tool, or maybe have them side by side together, just because I'm just want to give you the heads up that I think the tool can be a little intimidating if you have never used it before, but it is there for you to use. So it's great because if you are actively using the tool, then you won't have surprises. You'll have a really good idea of where you are within these indicators. All right, so let's go ahead and define indicator 10. So indicator 10 Oh, shoot. Sorry about that. I was trying to move my Zoom and I hit the button. All right, so indicator 10 is where we are looking at those specific disability categories. So the definition is the percentage of districts with disproportionate representation of racial ethnic groups in specific disability categories due to inappropriate identification. So that's our definition that we are working with for indicator 10. As we look at that identify statement, we want to identify whether the rate of special education identification for specific disability categories of a racial or ethnic group of students compared to all the other racial or ethnic groups in our district is disproportionate. So indicator 9 is looking at specifically racial and ethnic groups, and indicator 10 is looking at those eligibility areas of the groups of racial and ethnic groups. So there is a little bit of a difference. They sound so very similar. As we dive into indicator 10, I just want to point out what areas are monitored under 10, under indicator 10, which areas of eligibility. So we have specific learning disability, emotional disability, speech language impairment, other health impairment, autism spectrum disorder, and intellectual abilities. So those are the eligibility areas that are monitored. That's another important factor to know and to consider as you work through some of your districts if you are out of compliance. It's important to know what eligibility areas we're looking at. And I've had a few, actually a couple new people join us. So I just want to say to you, welcome. And if you have a question as we go through this, feel free to throw it in the chat. You can also unmute and ask your question if you would prefer. I will do my best to answer the question, but if I can't, because I just want to be sure I'm giving you the correct responses, then I will let you know and get that answer for you. And if you have district specific questions also, we can try to answer those as well. But I'm going to give you my contact information at the end. Always feel free to reach out to me. All right, so this is very similar to the slide that I showed you for indicator 9. The difference is that the link at the bottom is specifically for indicator 10. So it's going to take you to the root cause analysis tool that is set specifically for indicator 10. And if you've not been to DOE's website, it is laid out very user-friendly in this section. Everything is labeled very clearly so that you can click on the links and access the materials very easily. All right, so when we look at the different groups and eligibilities that are most often overrepresented, we really see it in 3 main areas. So we see an overrepresentation of Black males being found eligible for emotional disability. We find an overrepresentation of Black males being identified under intellectual disability, and white males under autism spectrum disorder. So just to kind of throw a question out to you, if anyone would like to answer, and there is really no correct answer. There are just a lot of guesses that we have. What do you think could be some of the causes of the overrepresentation of these groups of students and eligibility areas? I'm asking this to help us just to really start thinking about our root causes. So if you are in DisPro, once we start to consider these areas, then we're really thinking about the root cause of the problem for our specific district. We have to always be looking and asking ourselves that question of what is causing this overrepresentation? Because oftentimes, once we start to dig into that a little bit, then it becomes clear what some of those existing beliefs, policies, and practices might be that have unintentionally created this environment where we have this disproportionate representation of our students. And I just want to double check in the chat to make sure no one has responded to anything in there. As we go on, if you have an idea, please throw it in there. It would be great to be able to discuss it and to talk through it. So please don't hesitate to do that, even if we're on a different section. All right, so as we look at just some contributing trend factors to disproportionality in general, here are some of the big reasons that research has found why districts are in disproportionality. So these are things that we want to consider examining as we go into like our root cause and we're examining our data. So the areas that have been identified through research align with different disproportionate areas throughout IDEA, discipline policies and practices, interventions and referrals, instruction and assessment, differential access to educational opportunity, family and community partnerships, teacher expectations and misconceptions, cultural dissonance, and district sociodemographics. So you'll notice that some of these have a circle around them. And those are really the ones that we are going to talk in detail about today, as they most hit on indicators 9 and 10. So I want to talk through each of these areas. We are going to talk just very briefly, not much, about a comprehensive evaluation and how to be sure that we are completing an evaluation that covers everything that it legally needs to. But there is a separate training on that. So if you are interested in more about that evaluation process, what the requirements are, I really encourage you to sign up for that training. It's on April 9th, and I'd be happy to send you more information on it. You can also find information on our website at iepta.org. So as we look, like I said, at indicators 9 and 10, we're really going to pay attention to those ones that are circled. So we're going to think and talk about how we can really use a culturally responsive education systems approach so that we are looking at just the different intersections between our policies, our practices, and the people who are delivering some of these services and making decisions. Because we really want to consider these and how they might affect our disproportionate outcomes. All right, so let's look first at interventions and referrals. So as we consider these, these are some questions that you can ask yourself. So some of these questions, I've tried to cite the sources when they come from Indiana Department of Education versus other sources. But IDOE provides some of these questions in the guidance that they have for indicators 9 and 10. So that's where a lot of this information comes from. And then I tried to dig a little deeper to find some more questions to ask, just because I think sometimes if we have just the more questions we have to look at, then the better we're going to be able to identify what some of our root causes are and where some of our problematic practices might be. So the first thing we need to look at is what is each school's tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3 interventions. So this is going to be very important. And I want to say it could be at the district level, but sometimes in larger districts, schools have different tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. If that's the case, then it might make things more challenging, especially if you're in a large district and you're over multiple buildings. So as you look at those, ask yourself really these important questions. Are evidence-based interventions implemented? So that is part of the law that says that when we're doing these interventions with our students, they need to be evidence-based. So evidence-based is that you know that they work. Either you've done them before and they work, or there is research to support that they work. So there is a difference between a research-based intervention and an evidence-based intervention. The next question, are all staff aware of and able to use the schools or the district's intervention systems? So new staff, as they're onboarded, have they been trained in the interventions that we are using? Has that been followed through? Do we know for sure that when they're being used the way that they're supposed to be? Do current intervention systems operate systematically throughout the district and the school? So the key word there is systematically. Do we have a system? Do we have a set procedure for how students move through these interventions and how they are taught? So as we look at specifically the tiered intervention, we need to ask ourselves, who's receiving the majority of tier 1 interventions? Who's receiving tier 2 interventions? Who's receiving tier 3 interventions? And at what percentage are we seeing students receiving those different services? So another question that we need to ask ourselves then is there a problem-solving team? Is there a team who meets on a regular basis? I'll even use that word systematically because that's a key word for us. Who is building that teacher capacity around interventions, who is examining all the data, the student data, the teacher data, the intervention data in terms of when interventions are happening, are they happening, student absences within groups, all of that sort of thing we need to be looking at. So as we look at this, one question that I have just as a reflection question for you is to consider if there are disparities in your intervention data by race, by ability, or by gender. So as we look at these areas, those are 3 categories that I really want you to consider, or when you sit down with your team to look at a root cause analysis, or to start to ask some of those why questions about why our data is showing what it's showing, we really want to look at that. So looking for those disparities, I want to say that again, in intervention data based on race, ability, or gender. So it's going to be very important. Are tier 1 strategies exhausted before students move into tier 2? Are they exhausted before they're moved from tier 2 to tier 3? And then what happens after tier 3 and there's a referral made for a special education eligibility? So again, as I go through these, if you have questions, please throw them in the chat or unmute. That's great too. All right, so looking at instruction and assessment, and all of these questions come from Indicator 9 Compliance Guide from DOE websites. You can find these questions within that guide. So does the district have an established MTSS model, multi-tiered model of intervention services? And this is twofold. This is for both behavior and academics. a lot of times we get into the mindset when it comes to interventions that we're just looking for those academic interventions. But when we look back at indicator 10, and we know that there is an overrepresentation of Black males and emotional disability, that really encompasses those behavior pieces. So what behavior interventions have been used with students before we get to that referral stage? So another question to ask ourselves is, has the district, and then even each individual school, so we have to look at this on a macro level and a micro level, established an atmosphere that views all students as our students, as opposed to my students and your students when it comes to receiving special education services. So really shifting that mindset, it may be an important task within your district or within your specific school. So we also need to look at the system that's been used for tracking students receiving those interventions. What's the fidelity? What's the progress monitoring? It's just another important reason that we want to keep that systematic process going, but we want to collect the data and we want it to be as standardized as possible. So we're collecting the same data on all the students within that intervention. Has the district in each school established a system for referring students for special education based on progress monitoring data and that tiered intervention service? So again, this goes back to what is the school policy? What is the district policy? So how does a student get brought to the team to determine whether or not a special education evaluation needs to be completed? Is it one person who always makes the decision? Is it a group of people who come together and discuss it? And then is that data consistent across the board? So if we're applying it to student A, we're applying it to student B, C, and so on. It is important that we keep those as systematic as possible, because when we start making exceptions to the rules, that's where we have some issues, and it's difficult to defend decisions and such when we don't have that consistency. So as you think about this instruction and assessment piece, and this is really where the April 9th training is going to just dig very deeply into, but we need to ask ourselves, if we see those disparities or if we feel that we have those disparities at both the school level and the district level, by race, ability, and gender. So really reflecting on those. And do special education teachers have access to the same professional developments, to the same materials, and to the same resources as general education teachers? So I've been in some districts where the special education teachers say, well, we don't have the same curriculum as the general education teachers. Well, that might be a problem. So that might be a place where we would want to start to look at some changes and maybe asking ourselves why this is happening and looking at some of the root causes. Is this a systematic mindset that we need to change? Is it a resource issue? What's going on to cause this? And then really also looking at that referral and classification process. Who is influencing that, or what factors are influencing that? Those will help answer some of the questions behind this particular area. All right, so now let's look at the differential access to educational opportunity. So what supports and resources would be nice though right now, wouldn't it? What supports and resources are available to meet the needs of students who are struggling to make progress in any area? And when we say any area here, yes, we mean academics. We are concerned about reading, we're concerned about math, but we're also concerned about those behavioral areas. So don't forget about those as well. During the referral process, What considerations are made regarding the cultural or ethnic background of the student? How are these considerations captured in the MTSS process? We need to be sure that we're looking at that. And in addition to, we think about the cultural and ethnic background, the language background, how long has the student been with us in the United States is another important factor to consider here. Does the district have evidence that they maintain a supportive environment for students with diverse racial, cultural, ethnic, and linguistically diverse backgrounds? This is just another important reason to keep track of records and to keep track of even the different professional development opportunities that your staff has, knowing who accesses those opportunities, and really identifying groups who may need more support or services in those areas. Does the district have an established multi-tiered model of intervention services for behavior and academics? Those can be two separate teams. You might have an academic team, you might have a behavior team, or they could be both. Within that team, do you have a representation from different areas? Do you have that general education representative? Do you have representatives from the special education department? What about the behavior team? What about an autism consultant? What about an instructional coach? So really examining, do you have those established? But then additionally, who is making those up? Because it's going to be important if we have to defend ourselves or show that we are in fact including a lot of different people from various groups within our district, it's important that we have that. So really consider those pieces. And I understand, people are busy and no one wants another meeting, but we really have to consider what we are doing to be in the best interest of our students. And sometimes I find, even for myself, that I've made an adult problem a student problem. And so I always try to ask myself that when I come to make a referral decision about a student, or I need to make an eligibility decision. As a school psychologist, I am recommending to case conference committees a student be or not be eligible for a certain category, and why. I have to have that proof. So the more information we can gather in this and like these pre-referrals, as we look at the interventions and we look at the access to these educational opportunities, the better we are suited to make those recommendations later on. So some questions that we could also ask ourselves for reflection as we are in asking ourselves all of these questions, we might want to look at things like, do we see some disparities in academic performance or course enrollment of individual subgroups compared to other subgroups? So maybe not even just looking at the overall performance, but what about English versus English honors? What does that information look like? Do we have disparities within that data? What are some potential sources for the disparity? Like what are the sources that we could use from the district level? What are the sources we could use from the school level? And then really asking ourselves, if we're in a school, what about schools within the district? Is there consistency within that? Because we should be saying, yes, there is consistency across schools within the same district. And then looking at how some of those demographic changes might relate to the academic and behavioral data. Those are going to be important questions. All right, so teacher expectations and misconceptions. 3 really big questions that we want to look at. Academic and behavioral referrals. Where are they being initiated from? Is it always the same grade level? Is it always the same teachers? Is it always the same classrooms? Is it always the same buildings? These are important questions, and these are hard questions to ask ourselves, I think, as we reflect on practices. Because we want to think that our systems are set up for all students to succeed, but sometimes we know there are gaps for whatever reason. And so we have to acknowledge some of those. What do district practitioners cite most commonly as the reasons for and or their beliefs about poor student performance? So this might be a mindset issue that we might need to work on. And maybe this needs to be just some training in some of these areas about the difference between different tiers and the difference between interventions and the difference between just high quality tier 1 and the difference between special education resources. And we're going to talk about that here in a few slides. And then looking at, are their staff or are staff and administration comfortable with discussing issues of race, ethnicity, or differences in their classroom and curriculum? And this is a hard question to have. And I think that's one reason why, on like a webinar like this or a training like this, it's smaller numbers, and because these are hard questions. And I think just acknowledging the fact that it's hard with staff might put people at ease a little bit. I don't know a lot of districts or individual schools or teachers for that matter who really want to get down and break apart these different areas, but it's so important that we do. And those hard conversations can really have benefit for us. And more importantly, they're going to have benefit for positive student outcomes. And so that's a reason why we want to take a look at these hard questions. When research tells us that there is this cultural dissonance and mismatch between practitioners and families, and the kind of services offered to students are often lower quality, and they might be even lower in expectation because there might be misunderstandings. So we have to look at some of these questions. Some tough reflection questions for maybe you as school leaders, and maybe questions for your teachers to consider, even parents to consider, because as we look at that multi-tiered systems of support framework, it's not just about one specific group, but it's about every group of stakeholder working together to increase those student outcomes. So we want to reflect on the beliefs. What beliefs do we maybe have about particular subgroups of students? What commonly held beliefs are there about the community at large? What about families of influence in the community? How are those affecting practices? Because they may very well be part of that. And really reflecting on the quality of relationships between practitioners and their students and families. Are things being affected by beliefs in that area? And here's another tough one. How are teacher beliefs influencing referral in the classification process, or even disciplinary incidents across the school and across the district? Those are important things that we need to reflect on and define as we move through. All right, so this area that we're going to take a look at is cultural dissonance. So is the curriculum responsive to the diversity and lived experiences of the student body in the district? So this is a really important curriculum question that you should ask as you are looking at adopting a new curriculum or considering a new intervention strategy. What are those evidence-based practices that will be responsive to our student groups? Do teachers rely upon a diverse set of instructional strategies to reach all students? And if they're not relying on a diverse set of instructional strategies, why is that? That might be a question that we would want to look at. Does our staff have access to those instructional strategies? Maybe it's just an education of the teachers that we need to examine. Are the teachers educated in those instructional strategies? And maybe we might need some training on different instructional strategies at a tier 1 level, tier 2, tier 3. Research and evidence shows us that there are some practices that work better than others, and there are some practices that work better with subgroups than others. So important things to consider. Do teachers and administrators hold high academic and behavior expectations for all students? This is an important question. We know that students with disabilities are expected to not just be exposed to standards but really they're expected to master the same standards. I read 3. Our students who are in 3rd grade are expected to master I read 3. It's not a different I read 3 for different groups of students. So we have to have those high expectations for our students. And then are those expectations clearly communicated to students and parents? Because sometimes those are 2 groups in this area we fail to really consider communicating those expectations to. But everyone in the school community needs to be aware of those. And then really asking ourselves, our student to staff, parent to staff, community staff, administrator to staff, and staff to staff interactions respectful and productive to the educational process. We know that we are always going to have a conflict of personalities. That's going to happen. That's life, and that's okay. We don't all have to like everyone else's personality, but in our world, it's about the educational process, and we have to remove some of those ideas that we might have. We need to approach every interaction so that it is respectful and so that it is productive, so that we are really propelling our students forward. And we're always looking to have the student best interest in mind as we work through some of these really tough questions. So the next part of this is really looking at the multi-tiered systems of support, because we want to look at what supports we have in place that we are using. So I am not sure if anyone is able to, but if you want to throw in what your MTSS process looks like, it would be great information. You could give us something to discuss. If not, completely okay. I'm going to go through kind of what the perfect world situation would be like as we think about MTSS and what that process might look like. So I'm going to take just a quick drink. So as we think through this, if you guys have things to throw in the chat, you know what I'm going to say. Of course, please go ahead, throw something in the chat. But when you think about MTSS, you might hear that it's just for behavior or it's just for academics. Like I mentioned earlier, that is the furthest thing from the truth. It really is about having those behavior and academics. And Lindsay popped in the chat and said that in the elementary level, we have an intervention assistance team who meets for behavior and academic needs. Perfect. And Rebecca, a work in progress, stronger for academics than it is for behavior and stronger at elementary than at secondary. Just from the districts I get to work with and be in, Rebecca, I would say that that is probably true across most. Those elementary teachers have the elementary frameworks seem to be working. I'm trying to think how to say this correctly, but the elementary systems are more of a well-oiled machine than those secondary. MTSS, it is a framework for multiple student support domains. So that's important to keep in mind. And a lot of areas like that well, maybe not intermediate, but those middle grades and high school level tend to kind of look past. So you might also hear the MTSS is a fad, it's just going to go away. But that's not true, because it's not a program, it's a framework, it's an approach to solve problems. So it's not anything that's going to go away, because we need it. We need to continue to ask ourselves the question that MTSS provides. MTSS is only for students with disabilities receiving special education services. That is absolutely false. MTSS ensures that each student gets the instruction and supports they need. MTSS needs to be a process that that RTI piece, that response to instruction piece, needs to be happening for all students. And it needs to happen for all students before we jump to a special education eligibility area. You might also hear something like, she's a tier 3 student, or we have a lot of tier 3 students. It's important to actually consider that the tiers represent supports. The tiers don't represent a student. So it's a student who receives tier 3 supports. Changing our language can affect mindset of staff. And as we just saw in some of those previous slides, some of the problems might stem from a staff mindset. So if we can change our wording, start to change some of that, we're going to start to do things to chip away at some of the mindsets issues that we may be experiencing. So another thing, MTSS is just one more thing, right? It seems like teachers want to say that often. It's just another thing. That's why it's a fad. That's why it's just going to go away. And MTSS is the thing to help you organize, deliver, and assess all of your other things, in quotes. And those things are things related to behavior, things related to academics, student well-being, all of those things. And we haven't really talked a lot about student well-being, but that kind of ties into those behavior supports. So those are things that we need to be considering as well. All right, so MTSS costs money and takes extra time school staff don't have. Well, the reality is that the goal of MTSS is to weave all of those together, to braid those initiatives, to identify and discontinue those ineffective programs, and to redistribute funding to effective supports and address areas that are missing. As you really start to reflect on your practices and looking at your programs, you might really start to see that, oh my goodness, our curriculum has gaps. Our curriculum is missing target skills. Maybe you have a lot of students receiving tier 2 and tier 3 services because the tier 1 isn't hitting those. And we'll talk about that a little bit more here in just a second. But these are some of the, you could even consider myths on the left and the truths on the right when it comes to MTSS. All right, so when we look at the MTSS framework, these are the 6 domains we are looking at. So it's important that they're all working together. They're all constantly, being evaluated, reviewed, all of that. The area that we're going to focus the most on is that multiple tiers of instruction and intervention piece, because that target area is really what will lead to the disproportionate representation of student groups and of student groups within eligibility areas. So we're going to spend some time talking about that. Just looking at my watch, I want to be sure that we've got plenty of time to cover all of this. So tier 1 is looking at that core, universal, academic, and behavior programs. So these are programs that are evidence-based, and we're using evidence-based programs and practices. So this is where we need to make sure that our staff is trained in the tier 1 that we have adopted. If it's a new textbook adoption year, are we training staff? What training's being provided? Most curriculum companies offer that with their curriculum. So we need to be taking advantage of that. As we have those trainings offered, we need to be documenting staff who are attending as well to make sure that we're getting everyone properly trained. So tier 1, for the most part, tier 1 is going to be effective if at least 80% of our total student population is meeting the benchmark. So again, that's 80% of all students. What we kind of see in a lot of places, especially places who are struggling in some of these areas with evaluations and the MTSS process, is that the triangle is flipped. You have more students receiving tiered supports than who are getting curriculum at that grade level presentation. So when we look at our tier 1, we have to have clear goals. What is it that we expect all students to learn? All students. That's not just our students who don't receive special education services. That's not just the students who are excluding those students who might receive multilingual services. This is all of our students. 100%, every student who walks through that door is a general education student first. They might receive some extra supports and services. Some might be high ability. Some might have a speech impairment, but they're all still expected to learn this tier 1. And then asking ourselves, how will we know if they've learned it? So what measures do we have in place to collect that data to show that mastery has or has not been completed? And then how are we going to respond when students do not make the progress? Or what happens when they've already mastered the content? Sometimes those behavior issues stem from that latter part of that question. Students have already mastered content, they're bored, they're acting up, and now we're going to start to see behavior problems. So those are some questions that we want to ask ourselves in establishing clear goals with that universal core curriculum. So like I said, as we look at on that previous slide, that number 3, how we're responding when students master, or I'm sorry, that's the second question. How will we know if they've learned it? Are we collecting that data? So at this level, the assessment is universal screening. So we have benchmarks 3 times a year. We usually have that beginning, middle, end of year benchmark. And this is part of our evidence-based core instruction. I'm curious, what are you using for those benchmark data points now? Are you using NWEA? Are you using iReady? What is it that you're using? You might need to be asking yourself that. And then from there, we really need to look at if the instruction is being implemented with fidelity. So this is going to come from looking at teacher lesson plans. Are they putting in their plans that they're actually using the curriculum? What are you seeing in your walkthroughs when you go into teacher classrooms? Maybe are those walkthroughs happening? But we need to be sure that it's implemented with fidelity, because if it's not implemented with fidelity, the way the curriculum company has shown you how to use it, then we can't say that the tier 1 is working. And it's probably not going to be working if it's not done with fidelity. So at this tier 1 universal level, all students should be having access to this. This is that high quality grade level content. So define tier 1 is the first step that you want to do when you look at tier 1 curriculum. What the heck are we even using? What evidence-based programs are used for universal instruction? So this is going to be, that curriculum that you have adopted. And then we want to ask ourselves, what screeners or assessments are used with all students? So I want to challenge a lot of districts who are getting away from some of these universal screeners with that NWEA, maybe even iReady, but because we are moving to the iLearn checkpoints, districts are moving away from, I've seen some districts moving away from things like NWEA. Well, that's okay, but you've still got to have some sort of universal screening, some sort of universal benchmark data that you are collecting, because iLearn checkpoints are checking, a specific skill. So what I look for at checkpoint 1 is going to be different from checkpoint 3. And we're not going to get that overall, just that really good score 3 times a year that we need to be looking at. So what's our benchmark data showing? Is our benchmark data showing that we have some discrepancies among different student groups, among males versus females, among special education versus students not identified as special education? What about free and reduced lunch versus paid lunch? Where are we seeing some of those gaps, or are we seeing them at all? Are we even close to meeting the 80% expectations? But then really looking at within those student subgroups, where are we at with that 80%? Is our tier 1 evidence-based? Are we implementing it with fidelity? And then maybe our tier 1's not salvageable. Maybe our tier 1 is really more supplemental, and we need to consider a new curriculum, a new tier 1. And then is it being delivered with the appropriate dosage? So are our students getting enough of it? Maybe they're getting too much of it. If you have 100% meeting tier 1, then maybe we can shift our focus somewhere else. When we think about issues of equitable access to that tier 1 curriculum, and remember, tier 1 is grade level curriculum. Access to highly effective instruction might vary. So if you've got multiple teachers at the same grade level or content level, you're going to have different levels of instruction. And so do students have access to highly effective instructional strategy or instructional teachers? Screenings indicating high need for intervention could lead schools to simply change the criteria for who gets access to the intervention. So that might be a fix that might be a little easier with tier 1. Screening results can result in over-identification of marginalized and or minoritized groups. So that's where I'm saying we need to really break down that data as we look at that overall question of, are 80% of our students meeting that benchmark, but then also going into each of those different subgroups that are important for us to take a look at and seeing if there's a disproportionality among those different subgroups. So our tier 2 instruction. So this is effective. This is going to tell us if it's effective if 70 to 80% of our students are improving performance. And so this is core plus supplemental. So notice how on these triangles, that yellow triangle is stacked right on top of that green. So supplemental is not in place of. Supplemental is in addition to. So if we have students receiving tier 2 services in this supplemental category, that means they are getting tier 1 plus tier 2 services. So they're getting core and they're getting supplemental. It's not one or the other. Where are the students performing now? So these are important questions to ask. And then where do we want them to be? How long do we have to get them there? So when we're looking at those tier 2 supports, this is where our students have goals that we are progress monitoring. What is the goal? Within an 8-week intervention? Is it a 10-week intervention? What does our evidence tell us that it needs to be? How much do they have to grow per year? How much do they have to grow per month? How much do they have to grow per cycle that we're looking at? And then what resources will move them at that rate? Because once we've identified the skill gap, once we've identified that research or that goal that we want them to hit, and we start to look at benchmarking, what is going to be the best supplemental intervention to get the student to where we want them to be? So this is where we're looking at progress monitoring in a very specific area of concern. We want to progress monitor about 1 time a month. I would say when we're looking at tier 2, it's a minimum 1 time a month. Maybe once every 2 weeks is a better way to track our progress monitoring data at the tier 2 level. Our tier 2 must be evidence-based supplemental instruction. So again, we're going back to evidence-based practices. So this is what we know works with certain groups of students. And then, is the instruction implemented with fidelity? Again, how do we know as building level administrators that our teachers are implementing this with fidelity? Just because we're collecting data on it doesn't mean that the intervention itself has been done the way it needs to be done. So we need to be sure of these. And that goes back even to that tier 1 question about students having access to people who are trained and people who are running it with fidelity. We need to know that. So when we look to define our tier 2, we need to ask ourselves 2 questions. What evidence-based supplemental programs are used for additional instruction? And then how will we progress monitor in that area of concern? And so that progress monitoring needs to be consistent for all students. And as we look at all of our progress monitoring data, are we doing that with consistency, with fidelity? Is it being tracked in the same way? And is everyone tracking the same information? So if we have different phonemic awareness groups, we need to make sure that we're tracking, maybe we're tracking accuracy, maybe we're tracking fluency. What is it? And it needs to be defined for everyone. And we need to be sure that we're collecting the same data across all student groups who are receiving tier 2 supports. So tier 3 is intensive, it's individualized instruction. So this is, notice how these triangles are stacked on top of each other. This should be 3 to 5% of our student population receiving these services. So this is a student receiving that quality, high quality tier 1 grade level instruction, and they're receiving tier 2, that supplemental piece, and they're receiving intensive individual instruction. This is not specially designed instruction. This is something that students can receive and should receive as they move through that response to instruction, that MTSS tier, when we think about academics and behavior. And so it's important to think about that too. I haven't really mentioned it with that behavior piece in tier 1 and tier 2, but we need to be working through those with behavior in addition to academics. So we know that this is going to be effective if there's progress towards benchmark or progress monitoring goals. So it's going to be effective if our students, when we are benchmarking at tier 2, if we start to see improvement there. And then are we seeing improvement in tier 1? If there's no improvement in tier 1 with the tier 3 support, there's a problem. So if we have a student who's in 4th grade and their goal has been the same and there has been no tier 1 movement, we've got a problem. So we need to look at where the student is performing now and where we want them to be. Again, how long do we have to get them there? What supports has the child received? Maybe we need to look at a different type of intensive individualized instruction. Maybe we need to look at the same, but it needs to be completed with fidelity. And then what resources do we have that will move that student at that rate? When we look at resources, it's important to remember that people can be considered a resource as well. So do we have the best people in place with the best evidence-based practices to start to move that needle? So tier 3, data should be collected at least once a week, approximately once a week. So we are getting a very quick turnaround on that information. Needs to be evidence-based, targeted instruction. And then again, it has to be implemented with fidelity, and we have to be confident that it is being implemented with fidelity. So define tier 3. What evidence-based programs are used for tier 3? That is important for all school leadership to know. And then how are you going to progress monitor that area of concern at least one time a week? So as we look at some potential solutions, because it's kind of, I don't want to say doom and gloom, but these are hard conversations to have. So as we look at some potential solutions, I wanted to give us some hope as we kind of start to close out this session. So if your root cause analysis or an evaluation of your MTSS pre-referral procedures reveals that your practices and procedures might be contributing factors to disproportionality, then review and revise some of those practices and policies and procedures. We wanted to ensure that students are not found eligible for special education due to lack of instruction in reading and math. So those are important things to consider. Review and revise policies, procedures, and practices to ensure that information about the social, socioeconomic, and cultural background is documented and considered when administering and interpreting that evaluation data. So it's not just, well, here are the numbers and here's what the numbers show, but it's really about here's what the numbers show as we take these factors into consideration, as we look at that social and developmental history, as we look at that cultural background, as we look at the impact of language and maybe English as a second language on a student. Here are just some more areas where we can look at to review and revise policies, practices, and procedures. But really looking at how the district and the school has their universal procedures, processes, what those look like for academics and behavior, and then how those results are being used to move students throughout that tiered instruction. And tier 2 and tier 3 supports are fluid. You know, we should, if we have a goal for a student, for a PA goal, our goal is to get them in 10, 12 weeks, move them to a different group, move them back out of it. Maybe they need to go up to tier 3, but it's fluid. Those groups should never be set groups. Look at your different tiers of support. What is your RTI? What positive behavior intervention supports do you have going on that are currently in place to support students who are struggling in the general education room or classroom? And then for those students who are receiving support in those gen ed classrooms, for maybe curriculum supports, maybe it's academic supports, but what systems are in place to ensure that those services are tracked and implemented with fidelity? And then what criteria is established for referring students for special education evaluations? And like I said, we're going to talk a lot about that extensively in that April 9th training. So if this is an area where your district needs to beef some things up, might be a good opportunity for your psychs to join, for your teachers of record, and even gen ed staff to be part of so that they can hear about those processes. Be sure that we create multidisciplinary student referral team at each school that monitors students currently receiving tiered intervention services in that general education setting. So tier 2 and tier 3, that is considered general education setting, and makes determinations for reviewing, or I'm sorry, for referring to that next level of support. So just some team members you might want to consider having on the team: administrators, intervention specialist, instructional coach, maybe even a behavior coach if you're looking at just a behavior RTI plan, special education teacher, gen ed teacher, a school psych, SLP, school counselor. Those are just a few of the people who would be important players on a committee like that. Really train staff on checklists for required components for special education evaluations. So once you get into that eligibility area, when you get into the evaluation piece, be sure that we have hit all of those components that we see. It's one great thing that I love about using IIEP is that there is going to be something that prohibits me from finalizing an evaluation report if I have missed a component or an area. So be sure that staff is aware of that. When we're sending out those multidisciplinary forms, at the start of an evaluation, does everyone know what they're supposed to be doing from the start so that they have as much of that 50-day timeline as necessary, or 20-day if we're on an expedited timeline? All right, so now what? Some things to consider. What are some of your successes that you're currently having? Because it's important to look at those. It's not everything is falling apart. I guarantee something's going right somewhere. So take a look at those and maybe you can build on those. Where are some opportunities for improvement and where are you seeing those gaps? What support do you need moving forward? Maybe teachers need training. Maybe we need just help in some different area. Maybe we're not even really sure how to start, and we just need from the beginning someone to walk through a root cause analysis. That could be a place to start. But really, I want to ask you, what can I do to help your district? And I for sure do not have all of the answers at all. But there are people at our center who do have different skill sets and knowledge bases that I can get you in touch with. So it is just a reminder that for us at our resource center, our services are at no cost to districts. So that's important because we're free. So we can work with teachers. We can, review some of your referral processes. Anything that you might think could help, I would gladly get you in touch with the person who could best meet your district's needs. So here are the references. Again, you'll get access to all of this. And then I'm going to just kind of open it up for any questions that people might have, comments. If you have a question that you want to direct just at me, I'll give you my contact information in just a moment. I just want to point out on this slide, the QR code to the right will take you to an evaluation for this training. So if you would like to give some feedback to know, just for us to know, was this helpful? Were there areas that you were hoping that we would hit on that we didn't hit on? Or just even if you have questions, regarding future trainings or anything like that. I did throw that link in the chat. The other QR code takes you to workshops that we offer. Again, everything is free. And we have a lot of universal things offered that you can sign up for, get recording links for, but then we can also, work specifically with your district. And we have a jot form that you can fill out for that if you need some additional targeted assistance. So here's my contact information. Again, my name's Katie Mosley. You can email me. That is my work cell phone number. So feel free to call. You can text, you can send me an email, whatever way is easiest for you to get a hold of me. But I'm here to support you any way that I possibly can. So we have about 14 minutes left. If anyone has a question that you want to ask, feel free. I'll give everyone a couple minutes and maybe I'll take another drink. It's the end of the day and my voice is tired. I hope that you all have restful weekends planned. I'm sure it was a crazy busy week. You're welcome, Melissa. Have a great weekend. All right, well, if there aren't any questions, I just want to leave with saying thank you so much for spending your afternoon with me. I really appreciate it. I'm thankful to each of you who were on here, and Emily, you are so welcome. Again, don't hesitate to reach out if there's anything that I can do to help support you in your district. I would love to help. All right, you guys have a great weekend.